Picture this. Toronto, Canada, 1921. A prison chapel so cold you can see your breath. Outside, snow hammers the iron windows. Inside, 300 men in gray uniforms sit in rows so rigid they look bolted to the floor. They've heard every sermon. They've seen every preacher who comes through those doors with his nice suit and his clean hands and his practiced sympathy. They've heard it all before. Then a man walks in. He's not wearing a suit. He's wearing the same rough clothes he wore in the fields of Punjab. His English is accented and strange. He has no pulpit notes, no prepared introduction. He simply stands in front of them, looks at their faces one by one, and begins to speak. Before he's finished his first sentence, a man in the back row is weeping. Before he's finished his first paragraph, 30 men are on their knees on a stone floor in February. The warden, who had seen every kind of preacher who ever entered that building, walked out of that chapel and told his deputy, "I don't know what that man has, but I've never seen anything like it." His name was Sadhu Augustin Bharati. He had walked barefoot across the Himalayas. He had been poisoned, stoned, left for dead in a snowfield, and thrown into a well to die. He had buried his mother before he was 15. He had watched everything he loved burned to ash. And out of that ash, something grew that none of his enemies, none of the elements, none of the grief could extinguish. This is his story. Augustin was born on February 3, 1897, in a village outside Ludhiana, in the Punjab region of British India. The house he came into was a good one, as houses went in that part of the world. Solid mud brick. A courtyard where the buffalo moved slow in the heat. A mother who kept it like a sanctuary. His family was Sikh. Not Sikh in the way a person sometimes keeps an old coat hanging by the door, wearing it when the occasion demands and leaving it otherwise. His mother, Kamla, wore her faith like a second skin. She was up before dawn every morning, sitting cross-legged in the corner of the main room, her lips moving with prayers so quiet they were barely sound at all. She read from the Guru Granth Sahib by oil lamp, and she believed, with a certainty that needed no argument to defend itself, that God was close enough to touch. She pressed this into Augustin the way a woman presses bread, not by instruction but by repetition, by the daily kneading of example. Before he could read, he could sit beside her in silence. Before he knew what prayer was, he was already doing it. His father, Hakim, was a prosperous man. He managed land. He kept good relations with the British district officers. He had 3 older sons who were steady and obedient, and then he had Augustin, his youngest, who was something else entirely. Not troublesome, exactly, but restless in a way that couldn't be explained by ordinary means. Hakim would watch the boy sometimes, sitting alone under the neem tree in the courtyard, perfectly still, staring at nothing anyone else could see, and he would shake his head and go back inside. Augustin's early years held the texture of any boy's years in that place and time. The dust, the heat, the breath, school lessons he was impatient with, because the world outside the school windows seemed so much more insistent. He had friends. He ran. He climbed things he shouldn't have. He was not, by any ordinary measure, marked. But there were moments, once when he was perhaps 6 or 7, a sadhu, a wandering holy man, came through the village. The man had nothing. He carried a small cloth bundle and a wooden staff, and his eyes had something in them that made the village dogs give him a wide berth, not from fear but from some kind of recognition. The village boys trailed after him at a distance, laughing and pointing. Augustin didn't laugh. He stood very still and watched the sadhu walk, and something in the quality of that walking, unhurried, unafraid, as if each step landed on solid ground no matter what was beneath it, lodged itself somewhere in him and didn't come out. His mother noticed. "You're thinking about the holy man," she said that night. "How does he not need anything?" Augustin asked. She was quiet for a moment. "Because he has everything," she said. He didn't understand that answer, not then. The year Augustin turned 14, his mother became ill. It was not a sudden sickness. It came slowly, the way the dry season comes, gradual, unmistakable, unstoppable. She grew thinner. The prayers in the corner went from before dawn to all night. Hakim brought doctors from Ludhiana. Augustin sat outside the door of her room and listened to their voices and to her voice, which was still calm, always still calm. She died in October when the first cool air came down from the mountains. Augustin did not weep at the funeral. He stood very straight and looked at the pyre and felt something exit his body that he had no name for. Later, he would call it the feeling of the ground being removed. You don't know you were standing on something until it's gone. What came after was not grief, exactly. It was something colder and more dangerous, a kind of fury with the universe that had no outlet and no target. He was 14. He had no category for the size of what he felt. He stopped eating with the family. He stopped going to school. Sat in his mom's corner in the early morning in her silence and felt nothing come. His father watched and said little. His brothers offered the sorts of things brothers offer: distraction, activity, the implicit suggestion that the body's demands would eventually reassert themselves over the spirit's damage. They were not wrong, but they were not enough. Augustin began in this period to search. He read whatever came to his hands. The Guru Granth Sahib, which he already knew in parts. Later, the Vedas, which confused him. A pamphlet from a Christian mission school in Ludhiana, which one of his school friends had been given and didn't want. He read it and threw it away, and then went back and retrieved it from the dust and read it again. He went to the mission school and argued with the teachers. He was not polite about it. He told a young British missionary named Thompson that his religion was the religion of colonizers and had nothing to offer a person who had lost something real. Thompson did not get angry. He gave Augustin a Bible and said, "Then read it and prove yourself right." Augustin read it. He read it specifically to disprove it. He read it at night under the oil lamp with his father asleep on the other side of the curtain. He underlined passages that seemed contradictory. He wrote rebuttals in the margins in his cramped handwriting, and on December 18th, 1912, 3 days after his 15th birthday, he burned it. He tore the pages out and he burned them in the courtyard, and he felt, for a moment, something that might have been satisfaction. Then he walked back into the house, lay down on his mat, and decided that if God was not real and could not be found, he did not want to keep living. He had tried the Granth Sahib. He had tried the Vedas. He had tried and rejected the Bible. He had knocked on every door he could find, and nothing had opened. He was 15 years old, and he was finished. He lay there in the dark, and at around 3 in the morning, the room filled with light. Not the light of the oil lamp. The oil lamp was cold. The light was something else, warm and sourceless, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. And in the light, a figure. Augustin would spend the rest of his life struggling to describe what he saw, and every time he would eventually say the same thing. A face, full of such peace that it made his bones ache. And a voice, speaking to him not in Punjabi, not in English, but in something he understood without language. "Why do you persecute me? How long will you do this? I have come to save you." Augustin sat up. He looked at the light, he looked at the face, and something in him that had been locked since October, since the pyre, since the silence in her corner, opened like a door that had only seemed to be stuck. He wept, not the cold, controlled absence of weeping at his mother's funeral. This was something else. This was the weeping of a person who has found a thing they did not know they'd lost. By the time his father found him in the morning, Augustin had made a decision. He was going to become a Christian. Hakim's response to this news was not mild. This is not a story where the family gathers and listens and perhaps disagrees, but ultimately respects the young man's journey. Hakim disowned him. His brothers refused to speak to him. The village turned. Food was taken from him. There was a period, Augustin never spoke of it in detail, but it is documented, in which his family attempted to poison him. He survived it. He was 15 years old, and his family tried to kill him, and he survived it. He left. He walked out of the house that had been built around him his whole life, and walked away from it. And he did not look back. He was baptized on his 16th birthday, March 3, 1913, by a pastor in the Sikh holy city of Amritsar. An act of pure intention that was also an act of defiance, a young man choosing the most sacred ground of his former faith to mark his entry into another. The pastor who baptized him was nervous. Augustin was not. On the day of his baptism, he made a second decision. He would dress as a sadhu. He remembered the man from the village, the one who walked like each step landed on solid ground, the one who needed nothing because he had everything. He bought a saffron robe with money he had begged, and he put it on and he began to walk. This is where the story becomes something that is difficult for modern people to fully hold. Not because it is supernatural, though it is, but because we have lost the category for a person who simply walks. who has no plan, no itinerary, no destination, only a direction, who eats when given food, sleeps in the open when shelter is not offered, and moves through the world like a stone moved by a current it trusts completely. Augustine walked north. He preached in villages where he was welcome and in villages where he was not. He was chased out of more places than he stopped in. He was beaten at least twice in those early years, badly enough that recovery took weeks. He did not have the resources to be anything but what he was. Thin, young, barefoot, saffron-robed, absolutely certain. In 1916, at the age of 19, he attempted to cross into Tibet. The people he told about this plan tried to stop him. Tibet was closed to Christian missionaries. It was also, at the times he attempted it, covered in snow that killed experienced mountain men regularly. Augustine had neither experience nor equipment. He had his robe and his faith, and the memory of the light in the room. He crossed. He spent weeks in villages deep in the mountains, speaking through interpreters, through gesture, through the particular language of sitting quietly in someone's presence without wanting anything from them, which turns out to be a language universally understood. He saw things in those mountains that he wrote about with careful restraint, not wanting the miracles to overshadow the message. There was a man whose fever broke on the night Augustine prayed over him in a mud hut at 14,000 feet. There was a woman who had not spoken in 2 years who spoke on the 3rd day of his visit, so clearly that the village gathered outside her door to listen. He nearly died there, in a snowfield east of Lhasa, disoriented, exhausted, wearing only his saffron robe in temperatures that should have been unsurvivable. He collapsed. He tells it himself in one of his few written accounts, in the particular careful prose of a man who knows people will not believe him, but who cannot bring himself to leave the truth out. There was warmth. Not the warmth of shelter or fire, but something else. He lay in the snow, unable to move, expecting to die, and warmth came from inside him like a furnace in a cold building, and he slept, and he woke up, and it was morning, and he was alive. He got up and walked back. By 1920, Augustine's name had begun to travel ahead of him. Not in the way of fame. He had nothing that could be pointed to. No church, no title, no institution behind him. But there is a word that moves through certain communities the way news of rain moves through a drought. Reliable, consequential, making people lift their heads before they can say why. The word that moved ahead of Augustine was, "This man is real." He came to Britain in 1920 at the invitation of a group of church leaders who had heard accounts of his work in Punjab and Tibet and wanted to see for themselves. What they saw was a small man in a saffron robe who spoke English with a thick accent and absolutely no interest in impressing them, who sat in the great stone cathedrals they brought him to and seemed slightly puzzled by the distance between the grandeur of the buildings and the nearness of the God he spoke about, who said things in the question and answer sessions that made the clergy go quiet and look at each other. Someone asked him how he managed to keep preaching after everything that had been done to him. The beatings, the exile, the winters in the mountains. Augustine thought for a moment and then said, "Because I have found a place where nothing that happens to me can reach. Not because I am strong, because I have learned to live there." From Britain he went to Australia, from Australia to America. And from America in the spring of 1921 he came to Canada. He was 24 years old. He spoke at churches in Vancouver first, then moved east. Hamilton, Ottawa, and then Toronto. The prison chapel in the east end of the city was not on any official schedule. A chaplain named Arthur Greaves had heard Augustine speak at a church on Bloor Street and had a thought. Not a policy thought, not an institutional thought, but the simple thought of a man who had watched other men suffer and wondered what might reach them. He wrote a note. Augustine accepted. What happened in that chapel on that February morning was witnessed by 312 men, and 1 warden, and 2 guards, and Arthur Greaves himself, who would write about it for the rest of his life without ever quite getting it right. He would say, always, that the closest he could come was this. Augustin Bharati walked into that room carrying something that didn't originate with him. And whatever it was, it found every broken place in every man in those rows and went directly for it. 41 men gave their lives to Christ that morning. The warden extended Augustine's visit for 3 more days. By the time he left, there was a Bible study running in the prison that continued for 11 years after he was gone. He was not easy to be around, those who knew him said later, not because he was unkind. He was famously, almost troublingly kind, the sort of person who made you feel that you had his full attention in a way that nothing in ordinary life quite prepares you for. But he made people uncomfortable with themselves, not on purpose, simply because standing next to someone who has genuinely lost their attachment to outcomes makes your own attachment to outcomes very visible. He had no money. He refused it, mostly. The church groups who hosted him would press envelopes on him, and he would give them to the first poor person he met on the street outside, with a matter-of-factness that was either infuriating or inspiring, depending on whether you were the one who had handed him the envelope. He had no fixed address. He stayed with families, in church halls, in hostels. He owned what he carried. In Canada, what he carried was a saffron robe that Canadian winters made entirely impractical, a small copy of the New Testament in Urdu, and a habit of waking before everyone else in whatever house he was in to spend 2 or 3 hours in silence before the day began. People who visited him in those early morning hours, even accidentally stumbling across him in a borrowed kitchen or a church vestibule, described the same thing. Not concentration exactly. Something more like absorption, as if he were not doing something so much as being somewhere. This was, he would say when asked, the secret, not a technique, not a discipline, though discipline was involved. A place. The place his mother had sat in the corner of the main room when he was a child too young to understand it. The place he had fallen into on the night the room filled with light. "I do not go there," he said once to a reporter from the Toronto Star who had asked him how he prayed. "I live there. The world is what I visit." There were attacks. There always were. He was accused at various points of fraud, the inevitable accusation against anyone whose claims cannot be verified by the methods available. He was accused of practicing Hindu mysticism under a Christian label. He was accused of being a tool of the British missionary establishment, by those who had not seen him make the British missionary establishment deeply uncomfortable. He was accused of self-promotion by the people who watched him turn down every opportunity for institutional affiliation and every invitation to have a building named after him. In Shimla, in 1923, a prominent critic published a pamphlet arguing that several of his accounts of Tibet were fabricated. The pamphlet circulated widely. Augustin did not respond to it, not because he was above response, he could argue, and sometimes did, but because he had made a decision early on that defending his reputation was not his business. "If God wants me believed," he said, "God can manage that. It is not my job." He went back to Tibet in 1924, this time deeper. The accounts from that journey are fragmentary. Some letters to friends in Britain, a few pages in a notebook, descriptions passed along through the networks of churches that followed his movements. He was in the mountains through the winter. He emerged in the spring thinner than anyone who had seen him before thought possible, and with a quietness about him that was different from his ordinary quiet. More settled, as if something had been resolved. He never fully explained what happened in those months. He said, when pressed, that he had gone to find out whether his faith was real when everything external was stripped away, and that he had found out. He came back to Canada in 1926. He was 29 years old, and his body was paying the cost of what it had been asked to do. The barefoot walking, which he had maintained even in Canadian winters, against everyone's expressed wishes, had left damage that was becoming visible. He accepted shoes. This was treated in the letters that circulated among those who followed his work as something between a concession and a small tragedy. He spoke at a conference in Winnipeg that fall that people would talk about for decades. The theme was prayer, and most of the speakers spoke about prayer as a practice, a discipline to be cultivated, techniques to be applied, hours to be scheduled. Augustin was the last speaker of the final day. He stood up, looked at the assembled ministers and church workers, and said, "We have been speaking all week about how to pray. I wonder if the question is not how, but whether we believe that the one we are praying to is actually there." The room went very quiet. "I am not criticizing the methods," he said. "I am asking the prior question. When you are alone in your room at 3 in the morning with everything you have built stripped away, Not your theology, but you. Do you believe he is there? He let that sit for a long moment. I do not have a technique to offer you. I have only this. I have been in places where there was nothing else, and he was there. Not because I was holy, not because I had done enough. He was there because he had promised to be, and he keeps his promises. That is all I know. That is enough. A minister named Gerald Forsyth, who was sitting in the third row, wrote to his wife that night that he had heard something in that room that he could not name and could not shake, and that he had spent that evening on his knees for the first time, and what he admitted to her was longer than he wanted to say. Augustin made one more visit to Tibet in the spring of 1929. He was 32 years old. His health was poor by then, a weakness in his lungs that the mountain winters had planted and the years had tended. His friends argued against the journey. He listened and thanked them and went. He was last seen by a group of Tibetan villagers in late April of that year. He was heading east into the higher passes. He was alone. He was never seen again. No body was found. No camp. Nothing in the passes or valleys or snowfields that the searches in subsequent years could locate. He simply walked into the mountains and did not come back. The mystery has never been resolved. Probably it never will be. Those who knew him best were, almost universally, less troubled by this than you might expect. Not because they did not grieve. They did, deeply, some of them for the rest of their lives. But because, as one of them put it in a letter written years later, where else would a man like that go at the end? He spent his whole life walking towards something. It doesn't surprise me that the walk took him somewhere we couldn't follow. What remains is the record, not the official record. Though there is one, churches planted, conferences addressed, lives documented in letters and diaries and the yellowing notebooks of prison chaplains. That record is real and it matters, but it is not the whole of it. The whole of it lives in the people who were in certain rooms when Augustin Bharati walked into them. The men in the Toronto prison chapel who found, on a February morning in 1921, that something they had given up on had not actually given up on them. The ministers in Winnipeg who drove home from a conference, asking themselves questions they didn't have easy answers to. The woman in Tibet who spoke after 2 years of silence. The farmer in Punjab who watched a 15-year-old boy walk away from everything and kept thinking about it for the rest of his long life. They all describe the same thing when they describe him. Not a man who had answers. Not a man who made the hard things easy or the painful things painless. A man who had, by some process of loss and surrender and long faithfulness, found a way to be fully present. To walk into a room and see the people in it. To stand before suffering without flinching from it or fixing it or explaining it away. To be, as one of his oldest friends wrote, proof of something. What was the proof? He was asked this question near the end of his last Canadian visit by a young theology student in Toronto who was earnest and persistent enough that Augustin actually stopped and thought about it for a while before answering. Proof that the thing is real, he said finally. Which thing? The student asked. Augustin looked at him with the particular attention he gave to everyone, the attention that made you feel you were the only person in the room, or perhaps that the room was bigger than it looked. The presence, he said. The secret place. The thing your mother was reaching for in the corner of the room before you were old enough to understand what she was doing. It is real, it is available, and it is waiting for anyone who is willing to stop being afraid of what they might find there. He picked up his things and walked out of the room. He was already looking ahead. He was, as always, on his way somewhere, and somewhere he arrived.